Canada's got the elbows up meme in response to this aggression. Canadians are booing the U.S. anthem at hockey games. As you can see, there are good reasons for that. However, that doesn't help improve the situation. Trump's faithful core are swallowing the lies and have turned on their neighbors to the north, saying, "How dare you have these 250% tariffs?"
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm going back to politics. There's been a lot of controversy lately over the new government of Donald Trump and the Republicans in the U.S., and it's had some significant impact on world markets and especially on Canada. And I just wanted to go in and maybe dig through some of the statements and some of the misinformation that's floating around, because while there's all of this upheaval, our enemies and people who don't want us to do well are sharing misinformation and pushing us apart. So I think, a little bit of a veneer of truth would help at this point. So what's going on? Donald Trump, of course, has fawned over authoritarians and dictators and has striven to emulate them in some ways. What do dictators do? They exploit weaker countries and expand their territory. Hitler had the Aunschlus, where he annexed Austria. Putin has Ukraine, and Trump wants Canada and Greenland. The international community allowed Putin to take Crimea with little repercussions. Could Trump be interested in doing the same thing to Canada? Well, what's the evidence? Is this something we really should be worried about? Come on. The U.S. isn't going to invade Canada. Some people, maybe we have Trump Derangement Syndrome. Maybe we're just going crazy and thinking of things that just aren't there. Well, the key is to really look at both actions and words and don't fall for memes that are being spread by bad actors. Is Trump just joking? Is this a negotiation tactic? I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a negotiation tactic. If you like what you're hearing, I hope you press like on your podcast app. I'd love you to share this with your friends. I'd love to discuss it with you on my Facebook group. This is kind of something we haven't really experienced in a long time. So it's history in the making. I don't know where it's going. And I'd love to chat with you about it. So there's been a lot of fear-mongering going around on social media. Canadians are hearing about leaked maps from the U.S. showing invasion plans. U.S. audiences are hearing horror stories about Canada's drugs and tariffs hurting Americans. What are the facts? This is a job for the Rational View. So I've gone through something of a timeline of Trump's presidency, his election and presidency. But I want to go back first all the way to November 30th, 2018. The United States, Canada, and Mexico finalized a trade agreement. Trump personally negotiated the terms and signed the document, celebrating it as the greatest trade agreement in history. This is the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA after Trump instituted tariffs on Canada and forced us to negotiating table to give up more concessions. Now, 6 years later, November 29th, 2024, in a face-to-face meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Trump threatens to impose 25% tariffs, and then if Canada wants to avoid that, it should join the U.S. as a state. Okay. The next day, Trump publicly calls our Prime Minister Governor Trudeau and instructs his staff to only address him as governor going forward. He again suggests that Canada should join the USA. Well, at least Trudeau wears a suit. boggles the mind that Republicans are whining about Zelensky not showing sufficient respect by wearing a suit in the Oval Office. This is the criterion of respect, while the U.S. president acts like a gilded turd towards his closest ally. December 3rd, 2024, Trump remarks that he would split Canada into 2 states once annexed. So nice. I mean, this doesn't make sense, right? Canada is mostly a liberal-leaning country. If he annexed us, a Republican government would never be elected. Of course, maybe he'll treat us like Puerto Rico and not give us representation. That's, possibly. This is something that he's thinking about. December 10th, Trump posts that the majority of Canadians support annexation, despite public polling hovering around 13%. December 18th, he again falsely states that the majority of Canadians support annexation and that Wayne Gretzky should have a leadership role in the new scenario. January 7th, welcome to the new year. You've survived. At a press conference, Trump says that he would be willing to use economic force, not military, to destroy the Canadian economy and to annex it. This is something that, Trump is held up as a peacemaker. He doesn't start wars. And this is consistent with his previous statements that he doesn't like fighting. He likes bullying. He doesn't like warfare. January 14th, Trump again claims that most Canadians want to be American, despite new polls showing that now only 10% of us are open to the idea. January 20th, during his inaugural address, Trump says the U.S. will expand its territory during his second term. Ominous words, that. January 23rd, at the World Economic Forum, Trump says that Canada can avoid tariffs and economic collapse if it joins the U.S. in front of representatives from most countries in the world. January 24th, he publicly states that Canada will become a state. January 31st, he announces a 25% tariff on all Canadian imports to begin the next day. Markets collapse. February 2nd, Trump refers to Canada as his cherished 51st state and that it should join the U.S. to avoid the tariffs. And then the next day, pump and dump. A 1-month tariff delay is agreed upon. Trump, in agreement with Prime Minister Trudeau, states that he doesn't think existing border treaties with Canada are valid and they need to be revised. February 9th, in a Super Bowl game pre-game interview, he says he's serious about his threats, calling it a viable consideration for expanding U.S. territory. On the 10th, he announces an additional 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, coming into effect March 12th. February 24th, he publicly remarks that whoever signed the USMCA agreement is a fool. His own words, "We were led by, in some cases, fools. Anybody that would agree to allow this to happen to our country should be ashamed of themselves." Who signed the USMCA? Trump. But he's probably not smart enough to realize that. March 4th, 5th, and 6th, tariffs come into effect. Canada retaliates with its own tariffs. Pump and dump. Tariffs are again postponed until April 1st after a huge market backlash. Somebody is making out like bandits. I am so sure that Trump's friends are shorting the market and then buying back in. Again on March 4th, in an address to a joint session of Congress, Trump states that the U.S. will own Greenland one way or the other. That's a little out of character. One way or the other suggests military force. March 5th, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, told the Canadian Finance Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, that Trump had come to realize that the relationship between the United States and Canada was governed by a slew of agreements and treaties that were easy to abandon. March 11th, Trump threatens to permanently shut down the automobile manufacturing business in Canada if Canada does not drop tariffs on U.S. dairy products, which he doesn't state only kick in after a certain quantity of tariff-free U.S. dairy enters Canada, a quantity that was originally negotiated and agreed to by Trump during the USMCA agreements in 2018. March 13th, in a meeting with the head of NATO, Trump had this to say about Canada. To be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. As a state, it would be one of the great states anywhere. If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the US. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago. And it makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state. Now there'll be little disruption. There'll be a little disruption, but it won't be very long. They need us. We really don't need them. And we have to do this. I'm sorry, we have to do this. Sounds so much like Putin talking about Ukraine. But no, I have Trump Derangement Syndrome. Trump then recently had an interview with a Fox host. And some of his words, again, very similar, 51st state, tariffs disappear, taxes will be reduced, will be more secure, greatest, most powerful nation ever. Canada was meant to be the 51st state because we subsidized Canada by $200 billion a year. Just the misinformation, and I'm going to get into this. I'm going to address all of this in this podcast, and hopefully we'll get a better feeling for what the real facts are between the relationship between Canada and the US. We don't need their cars. We don't need their lumber. We don't need their energy. We don't need anything. I deal with every country, either indirectly or directly. One of the nastiest countries to deal with is Canada. That's true. We are. Good old Justin. I call him Governor Trudeau. His people were nasty. They weren't telling the truth. They never tell the truth. They'd say, well, we don't charge. Well, they do. They charge tremendous. And if you look at dairy products, what they've done to our farmers, I'd go up to Iowa. I'd go up to different places, Nebraska, and they would always complain about Canada, how they get ripped off. Do you know that Canada has a 250% tariff? 250. Nobody knows that. They charge us numbers that are crazy. Canada pays very little for defense. They think we're going to defend them. Do you know in NATO, they pay less than anybody else? They give us nothing, and they are the worst people to negotiate with of everybody. USMCA is good, but they cheat. An agreement's good, but they cheat. Okay, so that's Trump's feelings towards Canada. However, do we cheat? In 2023, a trade dispute panel ruled in favor of Canada, arguing that the Canadian tariffs did not violate the USMCA that he signed as the greatest deal ever. So let's go through some of these claims and see if we can fact check them and provide some perspective. He says that Canada is fueling a drug epidemic in the US by letting fentanyl through the border, a very powerful opiate that is resulting in many overdose deaths as it's being sprinkled into other drugs. But maybe what you don't know is that the U.S. is actually the bigger culprit in fueling crime with the flow of illegal guns and drugs to Canada. So what are the facts about drugs? When looking at weight alone, Canadian officials seized more illegal drugs coming from the U.S. last year than what the Americans captured coming from us. The U.S. seized 5,260 kilograms of drugs at the northern border in 2024, and a lot of it was cannabis because that's legal up here, compared to 8,300 kilograms Canadian officials intercepted coming from the U.S. in the same year. U.S. reported 19.5 kilograms of fentanyl seized from Canada, which is more than Canada seized from the U.S. So there definitely is a bigger flow of fentanyl from Canada to the U.S. But Canada is still not a significant source in the U.S. Less than 1% of all fentanyl seized in the U.S. comes from Canada, according to Canadian government data. However, speaking of fueling crime, in 2022, Canada seized 581 firearms coming into Canada from the U.S. That figure jumped to 839 last year. Since 2018, anywhere from 70 to 88% of guns seized by the Toronto Police Service have been traced to the U.S. So while it's true there is a drug smuggling problem, I think to say that Canada is at fault and slap tariffs onto us because of that is wildly misinformed. So what about those horrible Canadian tariffs? 200 and some percent that Trump is arguing 250% tariffs. Canada has been ripping us off for years with tariffs on dairy and lumber. He cited 250% tariffs on U.S. dairy exports to the country. It's not fair. It's never been fair, and they've treated our farmers badly. So, fact check. CNN reports Canada imposes exorbitant tariffs on certain dairy products, including a tariff on milk that can be as high as 241%, much to the consternation of America's dairy farmers who have complained for years that the border nation is treating them unfairly. But it's a tariff that only kicks in after U.S. dairy exports hit a certain quota. And below that, there are no tariffs. And guess what? American exports have never reached those quotas that were agreed in the USMCA. So we've set reasonable quotas for American imports of dairy, and they've never been met. There's never been a tariff applied to American dairy. But I want to talk a little bit about why this is and why tariffs are necessary and why Canada has this quota system. So Canada has supply management quotas on particular farm items like dairy, poultry, eggs. And this is mainly to prevent agricultural surpluses within our market and allowing to maintain a stable price for food producers so that Canada, because being able to produce your own food is a critical part of an infrastructure. And if Canada's farmers are all run out of business by big U.S. conglomerates, it's a larger country, they have more, there's going to be more competitiveness. We're going to be in a bad way. So it's strategically critical for a country to maintain its food supply. For dairy production, Canadian farmers, the controls provided by supply management have allowed federal and provincial governments to avoid subsidizing these sectors directly, in contrast to the general practice in the EU and the US. So we have less subsidies to our farmers than the US and the EU. And as part of this strategy, Canada negotiated very hard, and we were nasty when we were arguing for trade quotas in NAFTA and USMCA to prevent dumping of products from larger producers that would force small family farms in Canada out of business. Canadian farmers have to buy licenses to produce milk to their quotas. These market sharing quotas can be inherited or sold and have a market value. On the open market, butterfat production quotas, which allow you to keep dairy cattle, sell for something like $30,000 per kilogram of butterfat as of 2015. And this investment of $30,000 per kilogram would allow a farmer to sell the production from a single cow. To run a herd of 70 dairy cattle would require something like $2.1 million worth of these quotas. And this is used by farmers as collateral for loans, but it's also a huge debt barrier for new entrants into the dairy market. The Canadian supply management system uses tariff rate quotas from the US and other countries to ensure that the majority of Canadian dairy and poultry are supplied by Canadian farms, shielding Canadian farmers from these heavily subsidized dairy coming into Canada. This system protects Canada's family farms, but at the same time it limits our international competitiveness as mega industrialization doesn't happen here. New Zealand, for example, has gotten rid of their market quotas and is now a huge exporter of dairy from their highly competitive farm systems. And just to give some numbers, U.S. farm subsidies have exceeded $30 billion per year over the past 5 years. Now, the OECD average was almost 12% of gross production. U.S. producers were under that. They received 10.6% of gross production in subsidies, whereas Canadian farmers receive only 8% in subsidies from their government. So U.S. farmers are subsidized more than Canadian farmers, and they're the ones that are complaining. So moving on from markets and tariffs, deficits. In December, Trump claimed that the U.S. was subsidizing Canada due to its trade deficit. How much is this trade deficit? In December, Trump said it was $100 billion a year. Recently, he's upped that claim to $200 billion a year. So Is trade deficit a subsidy? No, it's not. We buy American products, Americans buy Canadian products, and you guys buy more of our stuff than we buy of yours. There's more of you to buy stuff. We can't keep up. We make great stuff. We have lots of minerals and oil and electricity that you like. Does that mean you're subsidizing us? No. We're selling stuff for fair value. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the trading relationship between Canada and the U.S. amounts to more than $760 billion U.S. a year. In 2024, U.S. exports to Canada were worth about $350 billion, while imports were about $415 billion. That gap between imports and exports left the U.S. with a $63 billion U.S. trade deficit with Canada last year. And most of this deficit was due to energy exports from Canada, such as oil, natural gas, and electricity. That's about a third of the goods that we send you are energy. If you take that out, in goods and services, we have the trade deficit. Most Canadian exports to the U.S. are unfinished inputs that American businesses use in their own production, more so than with other trading partners. Tariffs would increase the cost of all of the minerals and inputs into your manufacturing. So you take Canadian raw materials, manufacture them into finished goods with higher value, and now you're going to be less productive in your finished goods because the raw materials are going to be tariffed into higher prices. So you're going to have more trade deficits because of your tariffs. And going back to the energy, the reality is that the energy that we're selling to the United States is cheaper and more secure than the energy you can buy from pretty much anywhere else around the world. Canada is the only large net oil exporting country without a state-owned oil producer. And U.S. companies actually own $55 billion worth of our oil and gas sector. So it's your own companies that are going to be kneecapped by these tariffs on energy. Heavy crude oil from Canada's oil sands, of which the U.S. buys 4.4 million barrels a day, is currently selling for around $58 a barrel, while the U.S. is exporting your light West Texas oil for $68 a barrel. So we're actually subsidizing the U.S. to sell your oil overseas at a higher price by selling you our cheaper oil. And that decreases your trade deficit with Europe. Large Canadian imports of services from the U.S., like streaming and data services from companies like Amazon, Meta, Google, and Uber, are pretty weakly regulated and underreported, and largely untaxed, and then thus subsidized relative to other businesses. So we're subsidizing these big companies of yours. In addition to this, Canadian investors made $700 billion worth of low-interest loans to the U.S., fully offsetting the bilateral trade deficit over the past decade. And despite that, Canada incurs a large net deficit in investment income. $13 billion in net interest and profits flow south each year. So I think we've put that one to bed. Let's look at some other claims that we can address. So Trump has falsely said that the Canadian public likes the idea of becoming the 51st state. Overwhelming opposition. Canada is one of the world's highest tariff companies, he said. Though we're actually low in global rankings. We're in the World Bank list of 137 countries' trade-weighted average tariff rates in 2022. We were ranked 102 out of 137 and had a lower average than the United States. We're very similar. Trump falsely claimed that Canada hiked its dairy tariffs during the Biden administration, although they haven't changed since Trump's first presidency when he signed the agreement. He said Canada generally doesn't take U.S. agricultural exports, though we're the world's second biggest buyer of those exports. The U.S. Department of Agricultural The U.S. Department of Agriculture notes that almost all U.S. agricultural exports to Canada face zero tariffs or quotas, and Canada consistently ranks among our top markets for agricultural product exports, representing one of our most significant and reliable trading partners. Trump has said Canada prohibits U.S. banks. Is that true? That's frightening. Why would we do that? More than a dozen U.S. banks are operating in Canada today. We have tighter banking regulations. We require our banks to actually have some of the money that they lend out. And as a result, we didn't suffer as badly as the U.S. did in the subprime mortgage collapse in 2008, where, thanks to Mark Carney's Canada Central Bank policies and Canada's stricter regulations on lending, we didn't bust capitalism as bad as you guys did. Apparently, there are 16 US-based bank subsidiaries and branches in Canada, around $113 billion in assets. US banks now make up approximately half of all foreign bank assets in Canada. He said that Canada is constantly surrounded by Chinese and Russian ships. This is fiction. We actually invented satellite-based tracking of ship AIS signals. We have, a satellite constellation up there now, monitoring these signals and monitoring global shipping. We have a radar satellite that can detect ships globally and warn our Coast Guard when unidentified ships approach our border, and we scramble our Coast Guard ships and can direct them to the proper places. Trump was actually at one time suggested that Justin Trudeau was using the ongoing tariff battle to run again for prime minister, although he's already stepped down and his successor, Mark Carney, has been elected within the Liberal Party. He's falsely stated that Canada spends less than 1% of GDP on defense. Though NATO figures showed it was an estimated 1.37% last year, this is still lower than the target of 2% set for NATO members. And this actually, I think, is going to be one place where Trump's saber rattling is going to be effective. Canada has stepped up its military procurements already as a result of all of these threats. So I think, if we wanted to be nice to Trump, we could say that maybe he's just trying to get Canada to improve its NATO spending. And maybe he doesn't mean all the other stuff that he says. Maybe he's just, meandering and trying to force us to meet our 2%. And, that probably will work. But there's definitely a focused campaign of misinformation that's creating stress. It's creating anger, and it's designed to inure Americans to the real damage that's going on. Nobody's going to be going looking for insider trading while he pumps the brakes on the stock market a few times and then hits the gas. And there are bits of truth here and there, as I said, enough to convince someone who has a pre-existing bias that Canada is bad. And this will eventually lead to a renegotiation of the USMCA. Canada can't stand by with these tariffs on, as all of our steel and aluminum industries go bankrupt, as our joint auto sector collapses. Responsible people are going to go to the table and try to save these things, to save the livelihoods of all the workers that Trump is gambling on getting better deal for the U.S. And Trump is going to be expecting more concessions from the weaker partners. This also has had the unfortunate effect of galvanizing Canadians in a boycott of U.S. products. And this is going to hurt that trade relationship even more. Canada's got the elbows up meme in response to this aggression. Canadians are booing the U.S. anthem at hockey games. As you can see, there are good reasons for that. However, that doesn't help improve the situation. Trump's faithful core are swallowing the lies and have turned on their neighbors to the north, saying, how dare you have these 250% tariffs? How dare you rip us off? How dare you take $200 billion in subsidies from us every year? And Russians could not be happier at what is going on. Think on that. Do I have Trump derangement syndrome? Am I deranged? Am I making stuff up? Or am I having a reasonable view, perhaps a rational view of what's going on? Thanks for listening.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.